Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for 2022 World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. We at the DA's office are honored to present every year about elder abuse in our community here in Boulder County, particularly on this International Elder Abuse Awareness Day to bring attention to this important topic. My name is Gardner-Wood. I'm Chief Deputy District Attorney here in the Boulder County DA's office and oversee our prosecution and community outreach efforts around elder abuse in Boulder County.
Good morning. My name is Michael Dougherty. I have the honor of serving as district attorney, and I'm really excited to talk with you today. Thank you so much for making the time for this important discussion on information around elder abuse. Perhaps most importantly, safety tips for you and your loved ones. We're really committed to making sure we prevent elder abuse from happening in our community. And when it does occur, making sure we bring a vigorous response to protect our older people in this great community. So thanks for making the time today. We're excited to speak with you. So a couple of quick facts about the District Attorney's Office. As you may know, we have jurisdiction over all criminal offenses that happen within the 20th Judicial District. Those criminal offenses range from shoplift and trespass all the way up to sex assault and homicide. And we have jurisdiction over all of Boulder County. There are 22 district attorney's offices in the state of Colorado. Most of the district attorney's offices have more than one county within their jurisdiction. But when it was originally established, it was established based on population. And Boulder, Weld, Denver, and Pueblo are all one county jurisdictions. So we have the great privilege of prosecuting cases that occur in Boulder County and working very closely with law enforcement to protect the public and enhance community safety. And I want to recognize and thank the over 90 members of staff here at the District Attorney's Office who work incredibly hard. They are really outstanding public servants who care deeply about public safety and doing justice while working to improve the justice system. We handle roughly 11,000 cases per year. 3,000 of those are felony cases. 1,000 of those felonies are violent felonies. And as Christian indicated, we put a priority on elder abuse cases, and we have a unit specially designated to handle any elder abuse cases that come into the office. We currently have 2 locations, one here at the Justice Center in downtown Boulder, and one up in Longmont at the courthouse in Kimbark and 10th. As I mentioned, our mission is to do justice. We work incredibly hard to enhance community safety while also working to improve the justice system. What do I mean by that? Working to improve the results of the justice system, reduce the likelihood of reoffense, and make sure the justice system is serving everyone fairly and equally. Our goal is to make sure that we help people and reduce the likelihood of any reoffense in the community with a design towards making sure we're doing our very best to protect the community that we serve. Part of community service for us is being out in the community and doing a lot of community outreach so that people have the information they need to prevent crimes from happening, preventing themselves from being victimized by a crime, and also building trust in the justice system and what we do here at the Boulder District Attorney's Office.
So I'm going to start, and I should have done this introduction to begin with, but under the way this webinar is set up through Zoom, feel free to put questions in the question and answer box. Because Michael and I will be running the PowerPoint and speaking, we'll try to get to questions at the end and answer those that people may have. So feel free to put those in and we'll try to go back through them as we have an opportunity towards the end of our webinar this morning. But let's start with what we're talking about when we say elder abuse, and today marking Elder Abuse Awareness Day. We're talking about physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, and caretaker neglect. Now, within the realm of elder abuse, it's a broad category, and it's a category that includes both criminal offenses as well as non-criminal offenses. So, for example, we work very closely with Adult Protective Services and are honored to work with them and have a great relationship with the good people that are doing the work over at APS. APS deals with, in some areas, a broader category of elder abuse. They would have things such as self-neglect. Of course, if it's self-neglect of an older adult, that's elder abuse under the APS standards, but of course there's no prosecution that exists because it's not somebody else committing a crime against another person. It's somebody that needs help and services from within the community, and the great folks at APS are doing some of that. Likewise, within Colorado, elder abuse is defined as 70 years of age or older. Those are by statute people that reach the definition of at-risk adults. Within the APS standards, just being of a certain age doesn't necessarily mean that it's an elder abuse circumstance, where for criminal purposes that Michael and I deal with, that does make it elder abuse within the criminal statutes. So some distinctions there between criminal elder abuse and maybe within the adult protection side. While we're talking about elder abuse and that definition of at risk, it's at risk that defines the crimes that we're dealing with. And again, anyone 70 or older fits that definition. But individuals that are under the age of 70 also can be at risk based on their disability. So those could be adults over the age of 18 to the age of 69, or even juveniles who have an intellectual or developmental disability. In many circumstances, being at risk, what that does is it carries an increased charge for somebody that perpetrates crimes against that vulnerable population. So a third-degree assault, for example, causing injury or pain to another person is typically a Class 1 misdemeanor within the state of Colorado. If that happens against an older adult or an at-risk person, that becomes a Class 6 felony.
But what's the rationale for that, Christian? Why is it that if someone's 75 years old and the victim of what would otherwise be a third-degree assault, why is the penalty more severe in the state of Colorado?
It's a great question. With that, what it is looking at from the General Assembly, and I think we agree with that as a DA's office, is that somebody perpetrating a crime against a vulnerable population. And so there's additional protections for those vulnerable populations. So whether that's 75-year-old individual or somebody that has an intellectual or developmental disability, that the person perpetrating it in most of the circumstances is perpetrating it because of the fact that that person is vulnerable. Or on the flip side, even if it's not because they're perpetrating it because the individual is vulnerable, the consequences to somebody that is 75 years or older can be more significant. So for example, if I push you right now, the consequences for you are probably less significant versus
because I'm under 7.
Because you're under 7. Versus somebody that I may push that is 70 or 75 years old, who, if they fall backwards from that push, is much more likely to have a broken bone, bruises, substantial injury from what would otherwise be that third-degree assault.
So the law recognizes that individuals who commit these offenses are perhaps preying upon the more vulnerable in our community, or that the victims might be more vulnerable to greater harm caused by the individual, and perhaps the protection for our greatest generation is deserved.
Absolutely, certainly. And I will also say, when we're talking about at-risk individuals or our older adults, there's some crimes that we have in the state of Colorado that just exist for that population. So for example, exploitation offenses, financial exploitation of an at-risk individual is a separate crime. Caretaker neglect, which we'll talk more about as we proceed, is a separate crime that exists only within that population of victims where they are at risk for many of the same reasons in terms of impact on that victim or the vulnerability for that victim. So on this slide, we see from some national statistics from the Justice Department around elder abuse. And there's a lot going on this slide, but I want to highlight a couple of things. What we see on the left, that pyramid to pillar, that century of change, you see a significant change in the population. In 1960, you saw that pyramid going up from young people up to older adults that we had in our community. It's estimated by 2060, that's going to be just much more of a straight pillar to where we have a substantial increase in our older adult population, which again increases the ability for people to cause harm to that population, people that are going to be more vulnerable, and a larger number of those individuals. We also see that it's certainly a prevalent problem. About 10% of adults 65 or older experience some form of elder abuse, be it physical, neglect, financial, sexual, etc., within any given year. but also we know that it is significantly underreported. So we then see that to the right of the screen, that for psychological abuse, only 1 in 12 cases are reported. In caretaker neglect, 1 in 57 across the United States is reported. And the importance of this presentation and the importance of having Elder Abuse Awareness Day is the majority of older adults live in our community. They're next door to us. We're going to see them at the grocery store. We're going to pass them on the street. 90% of those older adults are there in the community and may need our assistance, may have signs of being abused that need to be reported. These aren't individuals that are necessarily in assisted living facilities, that are in memory care facilities, nursing homes, et cetera, but rather living in our community that we need to be able to help them and deal with this issue of underreporting and be cognizant of the problems.
So we wanted to highlight for you that Colorado is actually the second fastest aging state in the nation. So by 2023, Coloradans aged 60 years and older will actually outnumber Coloradans aged 18 years and older. It's a really significant factor for us to consider as an office, but also as a community, as we do everything we can to protect the older generation and make sure that the laws are there to support them if they are victimized. And when we talk about whether folks are being victimized in Boulder County and here in Colorado, we would highlight for you what you see in that graph there on the screen, that since 2018, there's been a 29% increase in APS reports. Now, one thing we really want to emphasize about that, the silver lining about that number, is that it could also reflect people being more aware and willing to make reports. Christian just talked about how many of these offenses go unreported. So seeing an increase in reports can be concerning, of course. It may reflect an increase in criminal activity, but it may also reflect raised awareness that mandatory reporters are doing a better job and that victims are aware that we're here to help them, support them, and serve them if they are victimized. So we encourage people to reach out to APS, law enforcement, and the district attorney's office. So this increase reflects not only a possible increase in criminal activity, but an increase in awareness and a willingness and ability for us to get involved and make sure people are being kept safe.
I had talked about the idea, I think sometimes there's misperceptions around where our older adult population is. So talking about 90% of that population being in the community and our neighbors and community members. Similarly, I think there's misperceptions around who is perpetrating that abuse. We hear a lot about things happening in care facilities. Certainly that's a problem and something that we need to deal with when it's reported. But what we know is that the perpetrators are typically not strangers. And in over 75% of the incidents nationally, that perpetrator is a family member and somebody that is very close to our older adult. But because of that relationship, there are certain factors, which again, we'll talk about as we go further in this presentation, but there's factors of isolation. There's factors of somebody that has control over that older adult that we as community members need to be aware of. And that's why we have things like mandatory reporting by certain people in our community that may have access to the older adult that wouldn't otherwise have that access because of that family member that has that control over their loved one and maybe perpetrating this abuse. So regardless of who the perpetrator is, it's certainly a significant problem and one that we take very seriously here in Boulder County and within the DA's office. But it's important to think about who these perpetrators are and what we should be looking for.
And if you look at that second bullet point on the screen, in over 75% of the incidents, the perpetrator is a family member. That also highlights something that we want to talk about in this presentation, which is the underreporting of elder abuse. So when someone's victimized by a family member, so for example, when you look at the pie chart, take a look, 40% of the perpetrators that are confirmed are adult children of the victim. So someone might have some reluctance or hesitancy around calling the police on their adult son who is stealing from them or physically abusing them. Perhaps they're scared about where they're going to live and who they're going to live with, who's going to care for them. But also, of course, they're worried about getting their loved one in trouble. So they might be less likely or less willing to report. So we really want to raise awareness around this point that often the perpetrator is a family member. And this conduct will continue over and over and over again until it's reported. It also highlights why the role of the mandatory reporter is so important. That if someone who's classified as a mandatory reporter, we're going to talk about that more in just a few minutes, but that the mandatory reporters take action to ensure that APS and the responsible agencies are notified if there's any indication of possible elder abuse, because you see how often it's committed by a family member and how often it goes unreported.
So we've talked about some national statistics, but let's talk here in Boulder County. From 2019 through about mid-2021 is when we have these statistics that you're seeing on your screen. What we're looking at over those 3 years is certainly what we've seen is large amounts of financial exploitation of older adults that we are looking at in Boulder County, followed closely by physical abuse and neglect, including neglect by a caregiver, by a family member, and then facility neglect you see there. We also see that our victims more often tend to be female older adults than males, although we certainly see both within that. So when we look at what these numbers add up to, we have about 234 cases of financial exploitation over this 2.5 to 3 year period, 107 cases of neglect, and 120 cases of either physical abuse, verbal abuse, or sexual abuse of older adults within Boulder County. Then this graph, again, there's a lot going on here, but we're talking about within those numbers that over that 2.5, 3 year period here in Boulder County, this is the distribution of who are the perpetrators that are alleged within these offenses. We talked about that national pie chart of 40% being adult children. Now we look to this in terms of what reports we have within the DA's office, and you see the generic category of caregiver is the highest. Then we have spouse and partner are very close to son and daughter. We then have grandsons, granddaughters, with that small area over on the right being the nurse, facility staff, hospital staff that are committing this. Again, going to that point that what we see in Boulder County is exactly what the Department of Justice nationally is saying, that this is happening by, one, people that are absolutely known to our vulnerable adults, but two, more often to be family members, loved ones to those older adults. So again, we talked about some of the types of elder abuse, but to put a finer point on it, here's the 4 categories that we're really talking about when we talk about that broad category of elder abuse: physical, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, and caretaker neglect.
Some of the groups that are most at risk based on the data, as Christian touched on, are women, but also individuals who are 80 years or older. They're more likely based on the data to experience abuse. Let's talk though about some common risk factors for abuse in later life. So if you know someone, if you have a loved one who has some of these risk factors, it's really important to be aware of it and to keep a special eye out to make sure they're not being victimized or taken advantage of. So dementia, mental health and or substance abuse issues of an older adult and or perpetrator, social isolation, and social isolation is a particularly important one, because again, the victim might be relying on one particular individual, and as a result, reluctant to report. Also, they're being cut off from other sources of care and assistance, and it's difficult for them to make a report if they are being abused financially, physically, or otherwise. And also another risk factor that we see in far too many cases is individuals, victims who are in poor physical health. So those are 4 common risk factors for abuse in later life. If you have a parent or a loved one who has any one or more of these risk factors, it's really important to be aware that these risk factors do expose them to a greater likelihood, a greater risk of being a victim of elder abuse. But the one thing we really want to stress from our experience and also from the data is that elder abuse affects older people across all populations and all groups, and it can occur anywhere. We live in a special, wonderful, and comparatively speaking, very safe community. Boulder County has overall far more or far less crime than other communities the same size as Boulder County, but we're not immune from the challenges and criminal offenses that take place elsewhere. So we want to stress these things can and do happen in Boulder County. That's why we're fortunate to have such strong partnerships with APS and the other groups that you saw on that first slide, and why we're so committed here in the District Attorney's Office to doing everything we can to respond when we get these reports, to thoroughly investigate them and hold perpetrators accountable. Because these things can and do happen to all groups in all areas of our country.
So again, it's important to talk about elder abuse, what it is, but it's also important to take away from the presentation, what are some signs that you as community members, you as professionals in this community should be looking for? So breaking it down into those 4 categories that we talked about just a couple slides ago, some signs of physical abuse. Of course, you have bruises, broken bones, injuries in various states of healing, indications of restraint, where somebody has been tied to a chair, tied to a bed, unexplained broken personal items within a home, repeated visits to emergency rooms, and being fearful of being alone with another person. And then just general isolation from other adults in the community, isolation from family members, from visitors, not wanting law enforcement to come into the home, not wanting medical professionals to come into the home. Those are various signs that should raise a red flag of physical abuse that may result in needing to report to law enforcement or to Adult Protective Services so that an investigation can be completed when you start adding up some of these various signs and risk factors that we have. Similarly, when we're looking at sexual abuse, indications of STIs or sexually transmitted infections, sudden depression, sudden avoidance or fear of people generally or of particular individuals, a sudden hesitancy to be touched in any way or withdrawing from physical contact, and then bruising or pain, difficulty walking, are going to be those signs that should result in somebody asking some questions, thinking about this, and then reporting to law enforcement or Adult Protective Services to do the follow-up and investigation that they are trained to do in their professional capacities. So before we talk about the signs of caretaker neglect, who generally is a caretaker? So a caretaker doesn't necessarily just mean somebody that is working as a home health care provider or as staff in a facility, staff at a hospital. Certainly those individuals would be caretakers, but we're also talking about family members. We're talking about sometimes neighbors who have agreed to help meet that older adult's basic needs in life. Now, understand, this doesn't mean that if you help your neighbor by grabbing some groceries when you go to the grocery store because they're an older adult, it's harder for them to get out and about in the community, doesn't mean that makes you a caretaker under the definition of it. But if we're talking about that next level of somebody who has assumed responsibility for the day-to-day care and meeting the needs of that older adult, that's somebody that is a caretaker. Somebody who has identified themselves as the caretaker for the adult, somebody that has access to finances and pays themselves to be a caretaker for the adult. That is somebody that is going to meet that definition. So again, it doesn't have to be a professional category of individuals that are caretakers, but somebody that is in that responsible role that makes them the caregiver. So the signs that we're looking at when we're talking about caretaker neglect, some of the signs are malnutrition, failure to provide food and water, unsafe living conditions, unsanitary living conditions, untreated problems. One that we see on a regular basis is bed sores, not getting an individual out of bed, not moving them, not having that physical activity, which plays then into the lack of medical aid. So for example, if there's not a walker for an older adult who we know needs it and has been prescribed it by their doctor, not having glasses, hearing aids, the proper medication. Or if they do have that medication, it's the improper administration of that medication or holding control over that medication that results in problems for that older adult. And then just generally being left alone when we know that older adult is unable to care for themselves or protect themselves and does need that caregiver, and that caregiver has assumed that role, but isn't providing those basic needs and isn't there to help that older adult that they have assumed that caretaker role for, or even are being paid to do that caretaker role for. And then finally, signs of financial exploitation. Typically, individuals have a pattern of financial habits, a pattern of how they use their finances, how they spend their money, when they go to the bank, if they're going to ATMs, if they're using credit cards, how they do that. So when you start to see deviations from that, when you start to have unexplained banking activities, or suddenly somebody that has paid their bills on time every month is now 3 months behind, and those bills are going unpaid. Unusually high dollar check amounts are being written. Personal belongings that are worth a lot of money are going missing. Uncharacteristic gifts to a caregiver. Unfortunately, we see this where a caregiver ultimately, maybe with the consent of the older adult, is now getting regular gifts of $10,000 here or there as a payment, if you will, for the care or for the companionship, which is certainly not appropriate and is outside the scope of what normal caregiving services would be. Or there may be things such as changes or comments about the life planning instruments, things like advanced medical directives, somebody's last will, etc. And I mentioned the idea of consent. Typically, when we're talking about an idea of theft or financial crimes, if somebody gives you $10,000, it's not a theft. Frankly, it's not a theft if it happens with an at-risk person or an older adult over 70 years of age. However, the difference with financial exploitation of an at-risk individual is if you obtain that consent for that financial gift, that financial compensation that you've received, you did that through deceit, harassment, intimidation, or undue influence. That puts us in this realm of financial exploitation of that older adult, which is a separate crime within the state of Colorado and is at the same category as a theft. So again, if somebody's using that intimidation or that undue influence to obtain money, essentially Colorado, in that same effort to protect our vulnerable adults, has said that should be treated like a theft.
So Christian, let me ask you, let's say we go to visit an 80-year-old friend of ours and he's just hired a new caregiver. He says, she's great. I just gave her a $10,000 check yesterday. We say, you just hired her last week. You've given her $10,000 as a gift? And he says, yes. Under what circumstances could that be criminal, and how do we figure that out?
It's a great question. It does require some investigation. It requires a lot of conversation and digging into the finances, talking to that caregiver, talking to that 80-year-old individual to figure out why that happened. It doesn't mean an older adult can't give gifts. They're more than welcome to do what they want with their money, but the key is investigating and looking for signs of that deceit, that harassment, or that intimidation, or that undue influence that resulted in that older adult giving that $10,000 gift to that caregiver.
Now, we're prosecutors, so we know that. But what if I'm not a prosecutor and I'm loading trucks at UPS and I go to visit my 80-year-old dad and he says, I gave $10,000 to the caregiver. And I think that's really suspicious because he just hired her, doesn't know her, doesn't have a lot of money, and he gives her $10,000. Well, what should I do?
I would say immediately report to law enforcement or adult protective services. Those are the professionals that can do the investigation, ask the appropriate questions to figure out if this is something that needs to be a concern. Certainly, if it's a loved one, feel free to ask them questions, but don't feel obligated that it's your job to investigate, that it would be your job to determine what in fact happened. If there is a suspicion there, people are always encouraged, get the professionals involved that are trained in these areas to look for the signs, to look for the elements of the crime, and to ask the appropriate questions.
Thank you. That's great.
So we have here a video that's going to take just a second to load up of an example of financial exploitation by a family member. We'll watch this for a few minutes and then we'll do a quick debrief about it and some of the things that we saw, which I think based on what we've talked about, you'll see some of those signs as the several minutes of this video clip starts to play.
Patricia King was a widow who was living alone in East Palo Alto. She was diagnosed with dementia. Miss King was 88 years old in 2008 when her niece, Miss Remmert, moved in with her. It was helpful to her at the outset to have her niece living with her because it was somebody to help her out around the house and keep her.
Oh, sorry about that.
Patricia King was a widow who was living alone in East Palo Alto. She was diagnosed with dementia. Miss King was 88 years old in 2008 when her niece, Miss Remmert, moved in with her. It was helpful to her at the outset to have her niece living with her because it was somebody to help her out around the house and keep her company. What she started to do was slowly consolidate her aunt's financial accounts, and she also had her aunt sign a quitclaim deed to her home, transferring ownership of the home from Miss King to Miss Remmert, the offender. Miss Remmert's cousins were becoming increasingly concerned about their aunt because of the isolation of Miss King that Miss Remmert was imposing. She was making it increasingly difficult for family members to come and visit.
Shirley began to isolate my aunt by becoming more limiting of the family and also of her friends and church members coming to see my aunt Pat.
Shirley Remmert had changed the locks on the exterior fence surrounding the home and had changed the locks on the home itself. So family members could no longer gain access to the home.
I had called my aunt and I let her know that I was coming. I called the police. Okay, all I want to do is see Auntie Pat. I don't care. Shirley called the police and asked that the police remove me from the house.
There were multiple parties that made reports to Adult Protective Services expressing concern about Miss King's welfare. One of the reports came from the bank where she had a checking account. She went to the bank on 4 occasions and she made 4 $10,000 withdrawals. The amount of those withdrawals combined with how close in time they all were caught the bank's attention, and Bank of America made a report to Adult Protective Services that these were suspicious transactions on an elder's account and asked Adult Protective Services to look into that.
A social worker who's described as a deputy public guardian who does just financial abuse cases became involved in the case because of the financial allegations.
They phoned Miss Remmert in advance and they made arrangements to meet up with her, with Miss Remmert at Miss King's house. The deputy public guardian made the decision to reach out to the East Palo Alto Police Department and ask them please to send an officer as a civil standby to simply provide safety and make sure that things at the home went as smoothly as possible.
She kind of gave me a brief of who she was going to talk to and why she was going to talk to her. I knew we had something a little more than just a civil standby. She had some substantial evidence and information.
When they went to the residence, they found Shirley there with Aunt Pat. The deputy public guardian had a very pointed and direct conversation with Shirley about the nature of the financial improprieties that they were aware of based on Pat's financial documents. And Shirley was taken aback, to say the least.
Miss Remmert was nervous. She was inconsistent. At that point, she threw her hands up and said, I liquidated the money.
What?
It's in my room. And at that point, I escorted her to her bedroom. She then pulled out a box of money. In the end, after counting, it was about $80,400. Due to Miss Remmert's inconsistencies with her answers, and finally showing us the money that she did liquidate, I arrested her.
Most financial elder abuse investigations are complex, and we generally advise law enforcement to gather their evidence and then consult with the district attorney's office to see what the next steps are before taking a suspect into custody. But in this particular case, the fact that the quick thinking East Palo Alto Police Department apprehended Ms. Remmert on the spot was crucial to our ability to not only preserve the cash that was seized from the home, but also to freeze the home and execute a search warrant. And a tremendous amount of crucial documentary evidence was discovered. This document over here, it says quit claim deed. When you signed this, did you believe that you were giving away your house? Oh, no. That should be over the house. The fact that the victim of a crime has dementia shouldn't necessarily indicate to you that that person cannot be a witness and an important witness in their own case. Do you want to continue to own your house until you die?
When I die, my people divide my house.
These are the kinds of cases that are nuanced. They typically involve very complex family dynamics that have taken decades to evolve and are only getting worse as time progresses. So if there's history with that family, Adult Protective Services will be able to provide that to you while you're in the field. And that situation that's in front of you that you're looking at is going to look really different through the lens of all of that information than it does when you're just standing on the porch with someone trying to figure out whose paperwork is more legitimate than whose.
At the end of the jury trial, Ms. Remmert was convicted of multiple felonies, and the trial judge sentenced her to 7 years and 4 months in the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The cash that had been seized from the home was released back to the victim, and the judge signed an order voiding the deed and returning Ms. King's home to its rightful owner.
So it's a very good example and a real life example of many of the things that we had talked about. We're talking about an older adult, somebody who has dementia, as we had talked about as a risk factor before. We see a family member who comes in as the caregiver. We start to see problems with the financial condition, the consolidation of the accounts, the quick claim deed of the home. We see the isolation that we've talked about quite a bit that was starting to happen even from other family members. But we see that people were doing the right thing in that case. They were reporting concerns. The bank was reporting to Adult Protective Services. The family was reporting about this, which resulted in Adult Protective Services and resulted in the East Palo Alto Police Department and San Mateo DA's office to come in and do a successful prosecution because of the evidence that they were able to obtain from all of these individuals and the quick action from these individuals with those reports of concerns. So we've talked a little bit about reporting, and we've talked about this idea of mandatory reporters. The idea of mandatory reporters are that there's certain categories of professionals in our community who must report abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation of at-risk adults. That's the law in Colorado for many of the same reasons that we've talked about why the statutes protect individuals and have different crimes and different penalties for somebody that's at risk because of their vulnerability. So when we look at some of those individuals that are mandatory reporters, we're talking about anybody that is a healthcare provider, a mental health service provider, somebody that works in adult care facilities, long-term care facilities, nursing homes, etc. Social workers that work for the county or for nonprofits, law enforcement, district attorneys like myself and Michael, personnel of banks, pharmacists, veterinarians. The idea is people that may come across these older adults and come across evidence that they are being abused or exploited. So of course, there's a reason when we're talking about mandatory reporting of adult or of elder concerns that personnel from banks are included in that because they're going to be the ones that see that evidence and see those changes in financial patterns by these older adults. So they need to report. the veterinarian, for example. This may be somebody, an older adult that isn't getting out of their home very much, but they have a dog that they care for that is a close companion of theirs, and they take the dog in to get treatment, get shots, get a checkup. That veterinarian may see those signs of abuse. That's why they are in that classification of professionals that must report this. So what does that look like? When we're talking about mandatory reporting, they must report to local law enforcement, and then local law enforcement will share that with adult protection and the district attorney's office within 24 hours of that information that led them to suspect elder abuse. But it's important to note, it's one thing when we're talking about mandatory reporters. We do separate trainings for mandatory reporters. We work very closely with personnel from some of the local banks here in Boulder County and talk to them about their obligations. In no way should that be the limit of individuals that are reporting. So we talk about down at the bottom here, everyone is urged to report. Anybody that has those concerns around abuse, neglect, exploitation, or even self-neglect, an older adult that is unable to appropriately care for themselves, should report to APS or law enforcement as soon as they can after discovery.
It's the law, and it really does make a tremendous difference. And we often think of ourselves as leaders in the state of Colorado, and in many areas we are. But with the mandatory reporting of elder abuse, that was only enacted a few years ago here in Colorado. If I recall correctly, there were already 47 states and Guam that had mandatory reporting of elder abuse on the books. So we were able to see the track record of success in other states and pushed hard to get the legislature to enact a law around mandatory reporting of elder abuse in the state of Colorado. And it's already had a direct impact on our ability to help victims and to address crimes against our elder population.
And I want to make clear one thing. When I talk with folks, a lot of times I'll get a question of, well, what happens if I'm wrong? Or how do I prove that this is happening? Well, 2 points to that. One, I will say, you don't need to prove it. Having a suspicion, a reasonable suspicion that something is happening or that abuse is occurring is enough to where a mandatory reporter must report, or anyone in the community should report. Just that suspicion. Leave it up to adult protection services, law enforcement, the district attorney's office to do the proof, do the investigation to prove that abuse is happening. Now, in terms of the question of what happens if I'm wrong, well, Colorado specifically deals with that by saying anybody that reports in good faith a crime, particularly when we're talking about elder abuse, child abuse against vulnerable populations, they are immune from any liability, immune from civil liability or criminal liability for that good faith report. Again, that suspicion is enough to report to law enforcement or adult protective services, and a person is immune for doing that good faith reporting to let the professionals who are trained in this area do the investigations, do their job to determine if there is a case of abuse. Because we talk the old adage, and it may seem cliche, but it applies. If you see something, say something, because you may be, in fact, the only person that sees something as it relates to this older adult and is able to say something and provide that protection that gets APS or law enforcement involved and then stops that abuse and protects that older adult.
So we are working collaboratively with our partners here in Boulder County to make sure we're doing everything we can to prevent elder abuse. So in addition to this presentation, where we try to raise awareness and provide safety tips, we have ongoing relationships, and we're really fortunate in Boulder County to have outstanding agencies. And you see just a few of them listed on the screen there. The Boulder County Area Agency on Aging, the Boulder Adult, I'm going to try that one more time. Boulder Older Adult Services, and then Longmont Senior Services. And you can see what each one of those agencies and groups have been doing over time. We have been working hard alongside them to make sure we're doing everything we can to provide support for our older population. So I'm not going to read to you what each one has been engaged in, but I would say that in Boulder County, we're really fortunate to have these agencies working so hard on behalf of our older population. And it also gives folks additional resources to reach out for assistance and support. So you see there under the Boulder County Area Agency on Aging, otherwise known as the BCAAA, the different things that they have in place to make sure that we're preventing elder abuse here in Boulder County. Similarly, for older adult services, some of the partnerships they've set up and helping ensure that Boulder is designated as a Colorado lifelong city, laying a foundation that assures all residents of Boulder are valued as they live, work, and age in the Boulder community. And last, but certainly not least, the Longmont Senior Services, where they have licensed professional counselors available for individuals, couples, and family counseling, as in addition to other services, including bilingual resources. So we really encourage you to engage these different agencies and to help us prevent elder abuse from happening in Boulder County.
And talking about those partnerships that we have in Boulder County, I want to highlight J-Call, which is being managed out of the Boulder County AAA, the Justice Coalition for Abuse in Later Life. That's based on a federal grant that Boulder County got through the partnerships that we have as a community to do training across our community, including and specifically for law enforcement and emergency medical professionals to deal with these issues of abuse in later life, elder abuse, and includes the DA's office, includes our law enforcement partners, includes adult protective services, and our local community centers like Boulder Adult Services, Older Adult Services, now you got me doing it, and Longmont Senior Services, as well as our partners at Mesa, our partners at SPAN, across the community that are coming together to prevent elder abuse within our community and using those federal dollars that we were able to apply for and get because of the long established partnerships that we have as a Boulder County community that we want to continue and expand upon in the years ahead.
So what can you do? Well, that's a great question. We have some tips for you on the screen. We really encourage you to share these tips with loved ones as well as your neighbors. First and foremost is just keeping in contact. And you saw that video with the actual real life case example. The key part of that was individuals keeping in contact with the victim. So stay in contact with your older friends, your neighbors, and your relatives. Check in with them, ask questions. If you see red flags, say something to them. Ask them follow-up questions and see what you could do to be helping. Because if you're aware and alert for the possibility of abuse, it'll help us prevent individuals from being victimized and also ensure that when they are victims, that we do our very best to quickly respond and prevent any additional abuse or any worse consequences. So being willing to ask questions and listen. Each of us has an obligation to stand up and help those around us. And that starts by being willing to listen and then ask questions, including being willing to talk about the issue of abuse in later life to increase identification and the reporting of abuse. One thing we really need to do, Christian, is reduce the culture of ageism and a fear of growing older by challenging an injustice and really challenging the stereotypes of older people. Do you agree?
I 100% agree. I think we need to recognize, similar to what the City of Boulder Older Adult Services is doing, that our older adults should be able to age, live, play, and thrive in our community throughout their lives, in their homes, with their neighbors, that this isn't about, they have dementia, so therefore, they can't take care of themselves. Therefore, we need to have these stereotypes about where they should be, facilities that they should be in, may be appropriate for them to be in a facility, but we need to challenge those stereotypes to make sure that we are recognizing that older adults should be our neighbors, should be able to age in their home, should be able to live a great rest of their life as they age and as they get a well-deserved retirement as they get older. Because unfortunately, one of the things that we see that I'll touch on real quick is when we see individuals that have experienced elder abuse, those individuals are significantly more likely to not be able to age in their home. They're likely to, much more likely to need financial assistance from government entities, from nonprofit entities, and more likely to wind up in hospitals, more likely to wind up in nursing homes, when many times their goal is that they want to age in their home and live and be happy in their home. But because of the abuse they experience, be it physical or certainly financial, that becomes something that they're no longer able to do. So we encourage you with that. We've talked about some of the partnerships and the great work that's happening here in Boulder County. You can volunteer with organizations. You can figure out how to assist. That could be working with Meals on Wheels that are providing food for older adults. It could be working with Longmont Senior Services and volunteering there. They do a great program of having people, particularly as we're coming out of the pandemic, come in for lunches, come in for events. Boulder Older Adult Services is doing that as well. And they need volunteers to be able to do that to help the older adults in our community. And then finally, and importantly, which we've hit on repeatedly and will continue to hit on, the importance of reporting, the importance of recognizing the signs that we've talked about and reporting that either to your local law enforcement or to APS, with their number being 303-441-1309. And then finally, again, there's that number for Adult Protective Services, but there's also the number for the AAA, the Area Agency on Aging here in Boulder County, their resource line. I encourage folks to use that. That's not for mandatory reporting. That's what it sounds like. It's for getting resources, whether for you as an older adult or for a loved one that's an older adult, figuring out what are the resources here in Boulder County, locally or in the broader community for those older adults in our community, so that they can thrive in our community and later in life. And then, of course, the number for the district attorney's office, you see there at the top. We are always here to help and welcome phone calls to our office. My division that I oversee, the Community Protection Division, we oversee our elder abuse prosecutions as well as our elder abuse community engagement and mandatory reporting training through the great help of Desiree Furley, our community protection specialist. We take those reports. We want to help the community. If you have questions, reach out to us and we will be able to either directly help you or certainly point you in the right direction. So with that, let's look. And again, I apologize because we're talking and running the slideshow. I haven't been able to see the chat and questions, so give me a minute and I will take a look at what we have.
We have some great feedback, which we really appreciate, so thank you for that.
There's also a questions of hoping these notes can be made available for access. Absolutely happy to make this PowerPoint presentation available. It's a great point. What I'm happy to do is throw it onto our website as a PDF. So take a look. I'll work with our staff here at the DA's office, and we'll have this available in the public information area within our website, so anybody can use those. And I hope that you will and can provide that to other people in the community. There's a question about the PowerPoint presentation being emailed out. Certainly, if you want to provide your email, we're happy to email it out. But I think the easiest, just because we didn't set up this webinar to where people had to register in advance, we wanted to make sure it was very accessible. Somebody could just log in at 10 o'clock and be here without needing to register. I don't have email addresses for everybody, so I think that idea of having it available on the website may be best, but definitely reach out as well if you'd like the presentation. Call the DA's office, we'll get it to you. There's some questions about particular events or particular questions about certain facts. This presentation is designed to be more about general awareness. We certainly welcome individuals to call law enforcement if there's a particular concern about a specific set of facts, or talk to Adult Protective Services about a particular set of facts within that.
And you see on the slide there the numbers you can call. So we had a couple questions about land valuation tax and a bill that had been sent out to someone. So without more information, I can't weigh in yet on whether that's criminal or not. I would really encourage individuals to contact the Community Protection Division here at the District Attorney's Office for the other resources we've shared, or also to contact law enforcement. We're really fortunate in Boulder County that we have some outstanding law enforcement agencies throughout the county, many of whom have detectives and officers who are specially trained and assigned to work on allegations of financial abuse and or elder abuse. And we really encourage you to reach out to law enforcement if you have any indication that a crime may have been committed. And as Christian indicated, as long as that report's made in good faith, even if you're incorrect, it gives the opportunity to law enforcement and to our office to thoroughly investigate and where appropriate to prosecute the offenders.
All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions or information in the chat. Again, I do want to thank everybody for joining us. Although today is Worldwide Elder Abuse Awareness Day, this is a problem year-round, so we're proud to highlight it today. But it's something that we talk about in the community throughout the year, and welcome your feedback and you reaching out to us throughout the year if you need help from the DA's office, from APS, from the AAA. Know that the resources are there, and there are people that want to help and do this job because they care about this community very deeply and want to provide the services that are necessary for the community.
And it really does take all of us. It's like that old joke, what's the difference between ignorance and apathy? And the guy says, I don't know and I don't care. We all have to know, and we all have to care. And that's how we make a difference for one another in our community, especially the greater generation of folks who've earned the right to live wonderful and peaceful lives free of being victimized by fraud or abuse. So please make sure you reach out to us. We really appreciate this community. We're honored to serve the community, and we're here for you for anything you need every day of the year. Thank you so much and have a great day.